With question 65 of the Summa Theologia, we start a new treatise. We are done with the treatise on the angels, and now we begin the treatise on the work of the 6 days. And so St. Thomas Aquinas is going to kind of laser focus now on creation. In fact, in a couple of days, we'll start going day by day, the third day, the fourth day, the fifth day. And so if you've ever been interested in, the details of the creation account, because there isn't a whole lot of information given in Genesis. Well, St. Thomas Aquinas is going to fill some of those gaps and talk about some of the thoughts and teachings on this, not only from himself, but of course always drawing back from the doctors and the theologians who preceded him as well. And you might remember that after the treatise on the Most Holy Trinity, there were a few questions that had to do with the distinction of things, the inequality of things, the reason for evil, the cause of evil, and that kind of had to do with creation. Then he ended that and went straight into the angels, and now that he's finished with the angels, he's ready to talk about creation in more detail before he gets into human nature. It's interesting, and I think we should really pay attention to the order of these questions and why he does what he does. And as you can see, there's going to be about 10 questions having to do with creation. And the first thing that he is interested in is the work of creation of corporeal creatures. So he's not interested any longer about the creation of angels. And he is interested in the creation of material things. And I think the significance of this is that you have to understand the hierarchy of being, where you have God and then the spiritual creatures like angels, and then you have these hybrids, the human beings, and then below you've got the lowest of the creatures who are corporeal. They don't have intelligence. And so throughout the history of theology and philosophy, there have been a lot of people that have said that maybe it's like God is too good to have created something material, that maybe there was like a bad God that created the physical world and a good God that created the spiritual world. And that's what St. Thomas Aquinas is going to kind of get at here. In fact, he's going to ask right off the bat in Article 1 whether corporeal creatures are from God. Now, of course, we would say, yeah, of course, things like this plant, this plant here, or dirt, or we're corporeal creatures. We have bodies, but we also have spiritual souls as well. So St. Thomas Aquinas starts off this by saying certain heretics maintain that visible things are not created by a good God, but by an evil principle. But this position is altogether untenable, for if things that this is interesting, if things that differ agree in some point, there must be some cause for that agreement. Isn't that interesting? So if the spiritual and the corporeal agree in some way, then there must be some cause that is in agreement with both of them. Okay, that's what he says. Since things diverse in nature cannot be united of themselves. Hence, whenever in different things some one common to all is found, it must be that these different things receive that one thing from some one cause. Okay, so now what do you think that one thing is going to be that all creatures have in common? As different bodies that are hot receive their heat from fire. But being is found to be common to all things, however otherwise different. There must therefore be one principle of being from which all things in whatever way existed have their being, whether they are invisible and spiritual or visible and corporeal. Isn't that interesting? Now, I would have never really thought about that. I've mentioned before that there was a 20th century philosopher by the name of Martin Heidegger, and he spent his entire philosophical career asking this question: what is being? What does it mean to be? And so the idea of being, the idea of it's called ontology, the study of ontology, the study of existence, is something that is extremely important in philosophy. And so now you know that this is the one thing that links all the created world together, and this is why Thomas is saying, no, God created the material world as well, because it shares in being with the angels and the spiritual creatures. All right, whether corporeal things were made on account of God's goodness. Okay, so now he's saying, okay, he's doubling down. He's saying not only did God create the physical world, the corporeal creatures, but he did it out of his goodness. And if you remember, we learned a few days ago about the early church father Origen, which he had a lot of good things to say, but he was wrong when it came to the hierarchy of being. And I'm just going to read this paragraph because it's kind of review, but I think it's interesting. In case you didn't see that video, Origen laid down that corporeal creatures were not made according to God's original purpose, but in punishment of the sin of spiritual creatures. For he maintained that God in the beginning made spiritual creatures only. Okay, so he made angels, and all of equal nature, but that of these, by the use of free will, some turned to God, and according to the measure of their conversion, were given a higher or lower rank, retaining their simplicity, while others turned from God and became bound to different kinds of bodies according to the degree of their turning away. Now, I didn't think about this the first time we discussed this, and I'm not 100% sure, but I think probably he would have said that the angels were punished and became human beings. And you can imagine the problem with this is that all of a sudden we are like just bad angels. Dogs are really bad angels. The earthworm is just a horrific angel. And then as the angels use their free will rightly, they become higher angels. This is what angels said. This is what Origen said. But this position is erroneous in the first place because it is contrary to Scripture, which after narrating the production of each kind of corporeal creature, God says God saw that it was good. Genesis chapter 1. Okay, so again, this would turn St. Thomas Aquinas' entire philosophy and theology on its head, because everything in St. Thomas Aquinas' theology is based on the goodness of God and his passing on that goodness to creatures, and all of it participating in the goodness of God. So Origen, that's why you never hear Saint Origen, because he got this wrong, and this is pretty fundamental. Hence, we must set aside this theory as false and consider that the entire universe is constituted by all creatures as a whole consists of its parts. Now, this next paragraph is going to be a great paragraph explaining St. Thomas Aquinas' cosmology. Okay, this is the explanation of the world, the explanation of all the different creatures in the world, and how St. Thomas Aquinas, very, very differently than Origen, explains how it all works together in a harmonious union. Now listen, this is really beautiful. He says, if we wish to assign an end to any whole, and to the parts of that whole, we shall find first that each and every part exists for the sake of its proper act. Okay, everything has a purpose. As the eye for the act of seeing. Secondly, that less honorable parts exist for the more honorable, as the senses for the intellect, the lungs for the heart. And thirdly, that all parts are for the perfection of the whole. Okay, this is key. This means everything participates. It's like a symphony. Okay, not all the instruments are the same in a symphony or an orchestra, but they all participate for the goodness, right? As the matter for the form, since the parts are, as it were, the matter of the whole. Furthermore, the whole man is on account of an Furthermore, the whole man is on account of an extrinsic end, that end being the fruition of God. So therefore, in the parts of the universe also, every creature exists for its own proper act and perfection, and the less noble for the nobler. Okay, the less noble are at the service of the higher, as those creatures that are less noble than man exist for the sake of man. I'm just going to pause there and say, it's interesting though, because in many ways the angels exist for man as well. Okay, angels, their very name means messenger. Okay, they are to bring messages to man, but they're higher than man. And so there probably will be more on this as we go forward. Whilst each and every creature exists for the perfection of the entire universe. Furthermore, the entire universe with all its parts is ordained towards God as to its end, inasmuch as it imitates, as it were, and shows forth the divine goodness. Okay, if there's no other reason to learn Thomistic philosophy, if there's no other reason to teach it to children, it's this. because it's all about goodness. It's about beauty. It's something that I think is lacking in the world today, is just looking at the world and realizing how beautiful it is and bringing that all back to God and seeing how all the creatures in the world work in harmony for the good of the universe. And this is a hallmark of Thomistic philosophy. This is really what it's all about, to the glory of God. Reasonable creatures, however, have in some special and higher manner God as their end, since they can attain to him by their own operations, by knowing and loving him. Thus, it is plain that the divine goodness is the end of all corporeal creatures. Okay, every single one of them. Article 3, whether corporeal creatures were produced by God through the medium of the angels. So St. Thomas Aquinas is still here saying, okay, are the angels involved in the creation of the corporeal creatures? Okay, the earthworms and the butterflies and the raccoons and that kind of stuff, were the angels directly involved? He says, some have maintained that creatures proceeded from God by degrees in such a way that the first creature proceeded from him immediately and in its turn produced another, and so on until the production of corporeal creatures. But this position is, guess what, untenable, since the first production of corporeal creatures is by creation, by which matter itself is produced. For it is the act of coming into being. The imperfect must be made before the perfect, and it is impossible that anything should be created save by God alone. All right, so there's another paragraph here, and I think it bears reading it. It's going to add a little bit of time here, but hopefully you don't mind. In proof whereof, it must be borne in mind that the higher the cause, the more numerous the objects to which its causation extends. Okay, the higher the cause, the broader its causation extends. This is very important. Now, the underlying principle in things is always more universal. Very, very important word, universal. I can't stress that enough. Than that which informs and restricts. Thus, being is more universal than living, living than understanding, matter than form. The more widely, then, one thing underlies others, the more directly does that thing proceed from a higher cause. Thus, the thing that underlies primarily all things belongs properly to the causality of the supreme cause. Therefore, no secondary cause can produce anything unless there is presupposed in the thing produced something that is caused by a higher cause. We produce babies. Okay, my wife and I have brought children into the world, but it was only, we didn't create them. We cooperated with God who created us. Okay, so the first cause extends further to all of causation, and this is what he's getting at. Creation is the production of a thing in its entire substance, nothing being presupposed, either uncreated or created. Hence it remains that nothing can create except God alone, who is the first cause. So we don't create our children, okay? We cooperate with God through his creation of our children, because none of us can create a soul, right? We just do our part, right? Okay, finally, Article 4, whether the forms of bodies are from the angels. Okay, now he's still getting into this whole thing about angels. What role do they have in the creation of things? And this is where we get into form and matter. Okay, we've talked about this a lot. The form of these elephants here is what we abstract for them, the universal of elephant, their irrational soul, is what animates them, what defines them. It's the elephantness of their essence and their form, of what makes them what they are, right? Because they aren't just the hide and the tusk and the teeth and the eyes. There's something more there. There's something real. And so what Thomas is going to say here, it was the opinion of some that all corporeal forms are derived from spiritual substances, which we call the angels. And there are two ways in which this has been stated. Now, I'm not going to get into a lot of the detail here because Thomas really, really gets into the weeds here. But he's going to talk about Plato held that the forms of corporeal matter are derived from and formed by forms immaterially subsisting by a kind of participation. So remember, Plato had the realm of forms, okay, where these elephants would just be a shadow of the real form of elephantness, right? But they're not real. The real thing is up in the realm of forms, and so Plato would say that realm of forms is what gives these elephants its form. And then Avicenna, who was the Muslim philosopher, however, and certain others have maintained that the form of corporeal things do not subsist per se in matter, but in the intellect. Now, this will be the last thing that I say. He says, but all these opinions seem to have a common origin. They all, in fact, sought for a cause of forms as though the form were of itself brought into being. And what Thomas is going to say here is that it's not that, like, God creates matter and then the form is brought in by some extrinsic principle. What he says is, quoting Aristotle, is that what is created is a composite of form and matter at the same time. And as soon as form and matter were to separate, or body and soul of an elephant, it's dead. So it is a composite. Okay, that's the substance. The substance is a composite in a material thing like this. And so it's not that some spiritual creature gave the form and God provided the matter. It's that God created the composite. He created the whole thing. And so further still, the species of the angelic intellect, which are, as it were, the seminal types of corporeal forms, must be referred to God as their first cause. All right. So hopefully that made sense. And we're just getting started now. About 9 more questions to go in this treatise on the work of the 6 days. Okay, creation. Tomorrow is going to be interesting because it's pretty heavy stuff before we get into the particular days of creation. Hang with me, though. This one today was a lot easier than what we're going to get into tomorrow, but we'll let tomorrow take care of itself, right? Thanks for watching. God bless you. St. Thomas Aquinas, pray for us.